Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this Texas Association of Community College HB House Bill 8 webinar. We've had a tremendous amount of interest in today's webinar, so I want to thank each of you for taking the time to join us today. So let me start with some housekeeping items. First of all, this webinar is being recorded, as we will make it available on the TAC website for viewing, and we'll get it posted just as soon as we can once this concludes. This is the first in a series of webinars that TAC will host in the coming weeks and months. Now, although today's webinar is merely a brief overview of the major provisions in House Bill 8, please check our TAC website in the coming days and weeks, as we will announce additional webinars to take a deeper dive into various aspects of House Bill 8. For example, we know that many of you are interested in gaining a more detailed understanding of the various program components of House Bill 8, in particular, the base tier and performance tier funding formulas. Although we will briefly touch upon those topics in today's presentation, a future webinar will take a deeper dive into these areas of House Bill 8, including a more detailed understanding of the base tier calculation, which determines how a college qualifies for a defined level of base funding for instruction and operations. For today's webinar, we've assumed that while most of you are generally familiar with House Bill 8, you will not be as familiar with some of the policy background that led to the passage of this transformative legislation. Therefore, today's webinar will focus on the policy reasons why the Texas legislature chose to revamp the funding formula for community colleges now, a brief overview of the work of the Texas Commission on Community College Finance, a general overview of the key components of House Bill 8, and finally, the road ahead, a brief overview of implementation of House Bill 8. And a few final items before we jump into the presentation. I'm joined in today's presentation by my colleagues here at TAC, Jacob Cunningham, Senior Director for Government Relations, Elizabeth Chivers, Senior Director for Policy and Strategic Planning, and Brady Franks, who serves as a consultant to TAC on budget and policy issues. Also helping us today with the presentation is Sandra Guardado, who serves as the Associate Director for Strategic Planning here at TAC. I also want to make sure we emphasize here at the beginning of the presentation the importance of the upcoming rulemaking process to implement House Bill 8. We will explain this a bit further at the end of our presentation, but please know that many of the questions you all may have about House Bill 8 at this time cannot be fully answered until we get through the rulemaking process, particularly the emergency rulemaking process that will take place over the next 6 weeks or so. All of this in coordination or in consultation with the coordinating board and a new advisory committee, which we will also touch upon for the end of our presentation. Lastly, and most importantly, I want to extend a very sincere note of appreciation to all of our community college presidents and chancellors. Make no mistake that House Bill 8 would not have happened without the unity of support from our college CEOs throughout this process. And my appreciation and our appreciation as well for the outstanding support for House Bill 8 from our trustees and regents across the state who were fully engaged in the work of the commission and during the legislative session. Thank you all. So now let's turn to our slide deck and today's presentation. Sandra, if you can go ahead and thank you. We're starting today with the why. This is one of the most frequent questions that we get when we're out doing presentations about House Bill 8. Why transform the community college funding model now? You can go to the next slide, Sandra, thank you. So there are many ways to answer this question and various considerations that come into play over the last few years, but I'll share 2 quick data points that are certainly relevant. The first is an emphasis on the state's population growth. The decennial census data from 2010 to 2020, which was released in 2021, show that Texas is the fastest growing state in the country in terms of sheer population growth. That population growth continues. Each year, the Census Bureau releases updated population figures for all 50 states. The last update occurred in December of 2022. And we found through that update that Texas continues to lead the country in terms of sheer population growth. So much so that we've now entered the 30 million resident club, if you will. Only one other state in the country, California, has more than 38 million people that call California home. That's about 38.5 million folks in California. Texas now has just over 30 million residents here in the state. So that's one factor, is population growth. And as this slide indicates, Texas, and I won't go through all of the data points in this slide, but the one that stands out is that Texas is the 9th largest economy in the world. Now, according to the May report from the Dallas Federal Reserve Bank, while certain sectors of our state's economy are showing somewhat weaker growth, overall, our state's economy remains strong and vibrant, with the Dallas Fed's Texas employment forecast issued last month indicating that jobs will increase in Texas by 2.6% for the remainder of 2023. So the second data point, which contributed to the need to reform the community college funding model, is based on the question of how will we keep our state's economy on strong footing? How do we make sure that our state's economic vibrancy does not diminish? Earlier this year, last January, you can go back to the previous slide, Sandra, the Dallas Fed released a report called All Eyes on Texas, which is what this slide shows. This is the cover of this report that was issued just in the past 6 months or so by the Dallas Fed. This report looked at the role of community colleges here in Texas in ensuring that we have an educated and skilled workforce. Now, while I won't go into all the details of this report, which is still available on the Dallas Fed website, one important takeaway is that our state's economy is expanding and it's changing, and therefore our need is critical for post-secondary education and training. One of the findings in the Dallas Fed report is that between now and 2035, the state expects to add more than 4 million new jobs. And while many of these new jobs will require a bachelor's degree or more, many, if not most, of these new jobs will call for middle-tier workers, those with more than a high school diploma, but less than a 4-year degree. And as the report says, few institutions are better positioned to provide jobs that are focused on education and training for these middle-tier workers than our state's 50 community colleges. You can move to the next slide. These next few slides will be data points that you're probably all already familiar with, a sort of commercial, if you will, for the footprint of our sector across the state. According to the latest enrollment data from the coordinating board, community colleges across Texas have 43% of all enrollment in post-secondary here in the state. That translates to close to 650,000 students enrolled at our 50 community colleges across Texas. And as the slide further indicates, 93% of all CTE training emanates from community colleges, 94% of dual credit, either on a community college campus or with community college faculty. And of course, we are critical for transfer. In 2021, 69% of all bachelor's degree graduates had some transfer credits from a community college, and 34% had at least 30 semester credit hours of transfer from a community college. Now, many of you are also aware that while a decline in enrollment was exacerbated during the particularly the two academic years associated with the global health pandemic, in fact, across the country, enrollment has been slowly declining for community colleges for the past decade. This slide indicates that despite this enrollment decline, particularly over the past 10 years or so, our community colleges here in Texas continue to help meet workforce needs. A 28% growth in CTE credentials in the time period indicated on this slide, 104% growth in academic certificates and degrees, again, between 2011 and 2021, despite flat enrollment or even enrollment decreases over that time period. And finally, just very quickly, looking at the data from 2021, we see that 28% of students across our 50 community colleges are enrolled in dual credit. 24% of students in 2022 were enrolled in workforce programs. And of course, this will be no surprise that our community colleges are among the most affordable in the country, as this chart on the left-hand side of this slide indicates. Now, we want to turn very quickly to just some background regarding the Texas Commission on Community College Finance. Lots of things were, as I said, were policy considerations for why it was time to look at the funding model for community colleges, which really had not been substantially changed in the last 50 years. And the task for taking a closer look at this fell upon what came to be known as the Texas Commission on Community College Finance. And I'll turn to my colleague, Jacob Cunningham, to talk a little bit about what led to the creation of the Community College Finance Commission and some of their work as well. Jacob.
Thank you, Ray. Well, it's easy to think that this bill was predestined for success or something that perhaps the community colleges came up with last summer before session. But the truth is that this has been years in the making and a lot of work leading up to this session and the success we've been able to have. In 2021, TAC and our members worked with the legislature and with Senator Larry Taylor to pass SB 1230, which got the legislature and state leadership to take an in-depth and comprehensive study of the community college finance system. The bill established the Texas Commission for Community College Finance, which consisted of 12 members, including 4 community college CEOs, trustee representative, legislators, faculty representative, business advocates, and really took some time to dig into the background and current funding of Texas community colleges. Similar to HB3, which had passed in 2019, and prior reform efforts for publicly funded education, this blue ribbon panel pulled together experts who were able to draw upon their own experience to come up with several recommendations for Texas community colleges. Kicking off in November of 2021, the commission met publicly 7 times, but importantly, they broke out into 3 different work groups, more informal work groups, probably met about a dozen times between those 3 work groups, discussing college operations, student supports, and workforce policy. And those work groups met with experts across the country, other state level policymakers, and really took a deep and honest look at what were the issues that were constraining the further success of our Texas community colleges, and just commend them on their open and honest discussions in those work groups to come up with ultimately a set of recommendations that were released to the public in the fall of 22 and ultimately approved November 17th of 2022, just in time for the legislative session in January. And these recommendations all essentially pivoted off of the central fact of how our community colleges are funded. We all know that state appropriations play a role in that, as well as local property taxes, and of course the tuition and fees. And similar to public education funding prior to HB3, you can see over time the local revenue and tuition ticking upwards as the state share of that funding started to trend in a more downward direction. And this led to the recommendations that fall into 3 different buckets: the state funding for outcomes, kind of the headliner of that, but also stressing the affordability and access for students, as well as investments in college capacity, particularly with a focus on workforce development. And I'll turn this over to our budget consultant and expert, Brady Franks, to give a little bit of background on that side of things.
Yes, I appreciate that. So one of the main provisions in HB8 was shifting, and the commission generally was shifting from a static formula to a more dynamic formula. So as y'all probably know, the formula is primarily based on kind of contact hours, students in the classroom, and a lesser extent was kind of success points and some other stable building blocks. And what the commission studied and kind of what the legislature had directed them to do was move the state towards a more dynamic formula that really funded more the outcomes they wanted to see as opposed to just kind of the inputs of having students in the classroom. And so that is what Elizabeth will talk about later, is kind of how we shifted to this dynamic formula and how it'll benefit both students and community colleges in the future. And the next slide kind of shows one of the reasons why this has become so important. As you'll see, as kind of Ray was talking about, the state during the Great Recession and the late aughts saw a very significant decrease in state revenue, which led to then a big decrease in community college funding in the 08-09 and the 10-11 biennia. And that hadn't really recovered in the following years. As you can see, any increases were very nominal over the next decade. And so what you see in that last column is what HB8, kind of the promise of HB8. Not only did they take kind of the existing money, but they added a pretty significant infusion of new money to really push those outcomes and incentives that the state wanted to see. And so that's kind of what Elizabeth is going to detail in the next slides, is how that is going to work in practice.
Thank you so much, Brady. So I'm going to start us off with just sort of some key highlights of what we see in HB8, and then go into a little bit more discussion, particularly around the outcomes piece, keeping in mind that much of this is still to be determined via rulemaking, but there is things that are clear based on HB8 as it stands today. So if we could go to the next slide, thank you very much. All right, so the key components of House Bill 8, we're going to touch a little bit on all of these today, and then have the intent to, as Ray mentioned, spin off some additional webinars that will go into more details around the specific pieces, particularly the performance tier and the base tier. But the main takeaways from HB8 are going to that affordability piece. We have created a new financial aid for swift transfer or FAST scholarship program for dual credit. We're looking at opportunities to help bolster shared services across our institutions to help our colleges build their capacity. The main funding change is really going to be around this performance tier and base tier, which I'll get into a little bit more detail here in a few minutes. And then the other really critical piece to all of this is that the coordinating board and our state representatives recognize the importance and expertise of our community college folks. And so based on that, HB8 includes the creation of this community college advisory committee, which will consult with the coordinating board in creating both the emergency rules as well as any other future rulemaking around HB8 implementation. Next slide, please. Okay, so as we already mentioned, we've got these three main buckets of the commission recommendations, which really informed what came to be an HB8 as a policy. And so we're going to start with the state funding for outcomes. Thank you. So when we look at basically the legacy funding model that we've had today compared to this new HB8 funding model, the previous model was really based on three main buckets: contact hours, core operations, and success points. And for some institutions, the success points may have been more than the core operations, but the bulk of funding really came from these contact hours. And so I think of this as like we had this pyramid of funding that was provided around formula funding. Under HB8, we really are flipping this. So it's not exactly the same thing, but you can think of your core operations and your contact hours as roughly going into what is called the base tier now. And the majority of the funding for all institutions is going to come from the performance tier, which is analogous to the sort of funding you saw under the success points in terms of breakups. So it's not an exact alignment, but really I think of this as we flipped the model around, and now we're saying we're going to fund as much as we possibly can around the performance tier, recognizing that some students cost more than others to educate. And so there are some things built into the model to help account for that. Next slide, please. All right, so this base tier funding piece, as I said, it's somewhat analogous to your core operations and the contact hour funding under the legacy funding model. So first, most important takeaway around our base tier funding is not everyone is going to get it. So the base tier applies if the estimated costs of instruction outweigh the estimated local share that is looked at for each college. So what does that mean? So it means that we start with a basic allotment based on a weighted FTSC to see how much your cost of instruction is going to be and how much funding we think will be brought in. If you have less than 5,000 full-time equivalent students, there will be an adjustment made to this to pull that weighted FTSC up to 5,000. So this is not a guaranteed amount you'll receive. It's a piece of the calculation that helps us figure out whether you are bringing in enough funds from your local share to actually be able to offset your costs. So if you think about that graph that we just looked at a few minutes ago, where it showed that your tuition and fees and your tax valuation, or I'm sorry, your local tax collections have continued to go up. This is that idea of, okay, how much is left over that's not covered for that. And so what we're calling the local share is based on an estimate of what your taxes would be if you brought in 5 cents for an M&O tax rate. And then there is an estimated tuition rate as well. So both the tax rate and the tuition rate are not the actual institutional values. So we set this average expectation and see where your institution falls. And so the tuition fees, for example, is based on a state average across all the colleges. But keep in mind, the tuition and fee component may shift some during the rulemaking. Right now, it's based on this assumption that, yes, we know we're going to do an estimated tuition and fees. And right now, the conversation is around this average. Okay, and then the final piece that sort of factors into this is this contact hour weighted by discipline. So much like the old model where you all did your report of fundable operating expenses that sort of broke out, here's how much instruction costs by discipline, and here's how much you get funded by discipline. That becomes a piece of this calculation now to help determine what are your costs and how well does your local share offset that. And if you find yourself in a situation where the costs are higher than the local share, your institution will receive this base tier funding. All right, next slide. So I feel like the base tier has a lot more pieces that still need to be worked out in terms of us all getting a clear understanding of what that formula is and exactly who's going to be eligible for it. We anticipate that many of the small and medium-sized institutions will be eligible for it. The performance tier is much more straightforward out of the two main funding sources. So for those institutions who do not get any base tier funding, they will be fully funded based on their performance tier. So the thing to keep in mind with the performance tier is it's basically tied to 4 main outcomes. So one is credentials of value, which includes our typical credentials that have counted under the previous model. So our certificate 1, certificate 2, associates, etc. What is new is that it's introducing this opportunity to get funded based on non-credit credentials. And so we anticipate that exactly what this looks like is going to continue to shift over time as we get our arms better around what is the breadth of non-credit programs that are being offered. So as you all might know, under the old model, it was based on contact hours. Under the new model, it's going to be linked to specific non-credit program credentials. And so for FY24, we are starting with basically 2 categories of non-credit programs. One is the traditional occupational skills awards, which institutions are able to report to the coordinating board. However, this has been a voluntary reporting. So many institutions actually have not taken advantage of this in the past. Now it will be wrapped into your actual funding. So the other main piece is around these basically institutional credentials that lead to licensure or certification. So This allows for shorter term programs to be accounted for that do actually lead to value in the economy, that help people boost their income, et cetera. And so there was an initial collection around these two specific pieces to give folks a chance to report in March. There was some initial follow-up, and then everyone should have received a request on Friday letting you know that there's further information being requested around these credentials to really help get those refined and in place for this initial year of funding. Okay, another key outcome is high demand credentials. So this is very much going to be tied to where are we seeing regional and state demand. And for those credentials, there will be a little re-up on it. So you can think about the standard credential has a set value. You get a bump up for if it's in a high demand field. And this is one of the pieces that needs to be fully fleshed out. But I imagine that the high demand field is going to align with work the coordinating board has already been doing, particularly the Community and Technical College Formula Advising Committee last year basically outlined a plan for looking at targeted fields and critical fields differently. And we see this as definitely influencing this high demand piece that takes into consideration both regional and state need. Then there will also be an outcome based on students who transfer with having completed at least 15 semester credit hours, and students who complete at least a sequence of at least 15 semester credits and credit hours and dual credit will also be a key funding piece. We're going to hear a little bit more about the FAST program for dual credit later, but I just want to point out that this operates separately. So no matter what, if your students complete the 15 semester credit hours, you get this outcome funding. So it's not directly linked to that FAST program. And then finally, we want to make sure that this is equitable. So we know some other states have attempted to shift towards outcomes funding as well. What was very important to the commission was that we made sure that this was not just a shift to outcomes, but also paid attention to the need for equitable outcomes. And so there are additional weights in funding tied to economically disadvantaged students, academically disadvantaged students, and adult learners. So basically you'll get the credential value plus any boost based on these weights that apply.
Okay, so going now back to the framework that was put forth by the Commission on Community College Finance. Again, state funding for outcomes, affordability for students. That's the next section that we'll do just a little bit of information here around the recommendations that were in fact now included and sort of in a sense codified by House Bill 8, a couple of things in particular that we want to point out for you. So if we can move to the next slide, please. So first of all, TEOG, we all know, is a critical financial aid program in place since 2001 for students who demonstrate financial need who attend our community colleges across the state. Prior to this legislative session, or currently, if you will, the funding allocated by the state for TEOG to our various institutions could meet the needs of about, on average, 28% of students who demonstrate financial need who enroll at our community colleges across the state. One of the recommendations from the commission, which was implemented through House Bill 8, but also through the appropriations bill, the appropriations process, which saw the additional funds that Brady had referenced in an earlier slide. So what the legislature did was to follow through on the recommendation, which was to increase funding for the TEOG program and concurrently to do the same for the Texas Grant Program, which is the equivalent program for students who attend our public four-year universities, to meet the needs of at least 70% of students who present themselves at our campuses and who demonstrate financial need. What this translated into is the second bullet here at the top of this slide indicates that TEOG state appropriations increased for the coming biennium by $133.5 million above current funding level. One other thing that's not on this slide that I do want to make sure that is and many of you may have heard about this issue, but what we call the TEOG match requirement. That was an important part of our legislative priorities related to HB 8, but even separate from, at least most of the legislative session, separate from HB 8. I think many of you know that for TEOG and Texas Grant, that when an institution packages a TEOG award into a student's financial aid bucket, that the difference between the amount of aid they receive in TEOG funding and the actual tuition and fees for that institution, that differential must be met by the institution, sort of a skin in the game proposal that's been in place since Texas Grant was created back in 1999 and since TEOG was created a couple of years after that. The difference, however, is that ever since Texas Grant was created, this differential has been in place for universities, but universities were able to count any Pell Awards, Pell Grant Awards in a student's financial aid bucket as meeting that differential. In addition to TPEG, which of course is a financial aid program for both public 2- and 4-year institutions through set-asides. Now, the Pell Grant was allowed to be counted toward the differential for universities, but for whatever reason, we could never quite determine what the policy rationale behind this was back in 2001 or so when TEOG was created. That Pell Grant allowance, if you will, was not given to community colleges. So the differential that we had could only be met either through TPEG funds, which don't spread out too far. There's not too much TPEG funding. The rest of it really had to be done through institutional funds that would meet that differential. And we felt that there ought to be equivalency, if you will, between Texas Grants and TEOG when it comes to this required match. We were able to get that match completed this session. There was actually a separate bill that was making its way through the legislative process, but one of the amendments that was attached toward the end of the legislative session to House Bill 8 was the language which now allows, moving forward into the next biennium, allows our institutions to count Pell Grant funding as counting towards that institutional match. Final point on this slide then is one of the recommendations from the commission is that there ought to be more flexibility in allowing TEOG to be provided to students who are in non-traditional students, adult students who are enrolled either in credit-bearing programs on the workforce or academic side, or on the continuing ed side of our institutions in non-credit credentialing programs. While this is not codified in HB 8, the commitment to do this type of flexibility for TEOG is very firm on the part of the coordinating board, and already work is underway to see what flexibility can be done through the rulemaking process. So a commitment is there to carry out this particular recommendation from the commission, although it was not codified through HB 8. Moving to the next slide, please. This is the slide again. This is the new FAST program, or Financial Aid for Swift Transfer. This is a funding allocation from the Foundation School Program for participating colleges to cover tuition and fees for all economically disadvantaged students who enroll in dual credit courses that apply towards an academic or workforce education credential, if you will. So what this does is for any student, any secondary school student who qualifies for free and reduced lunch, that student who wishes to enroll in dual credit courses that lead to a credential of value, if you will, should not or will not have to pay anything to enroll in those courses if the college chooses to participate in this new FAST program. As the second bullet here indicates, the coordinating board will set a maximum tuition rate for dual credit courses. This will be done by the coordinating board this summer. In fact, it's one of the priorities right now for the rulemaking process that Elizabeth will touch upon in a little bit more detail in just a second. But it would also be a rate that will be set annually or updated annually by the coordinating board. This tuition rate, as this slide indicates, will be done in close consultation with this new advisory committee on community colleges. And again, we're going to tell you all a little bit more about this advisory committee in just a few slides. But again, there is a lot of rulemaking around the FAST program. We know that many of you have questions about how this program will work. Not every colleges are not required to participate in the program. If a college chooses to participate in the program, they would have to not charge students who do not qualify for free and reduced lunch. They would have to not charge above the maximum tuition rate that will at some point this summer be set by the coordinating board. So again, we know there are a lot of questions around this program. We're monitoring developments closely and trying to keep everybody fully up to date, really on a weekly basis, or the advisory committee has been meeting with coordinating board staff every other week. So we're putting out updates on the progress of these discussions on a timely basis to make sure that everybody knows what's going on with implementing this new FAST program. And again, we'll touch upon this in just a second when we talk about implementation in just a few more details. All right, and then the next slide under affordability. Here, again, not codified in HB 8, but a commitment. One of the recommendations was an emphasis upon paid work-based learning opportunities. The tri-agency initiative, which involves the coordinating board, TEA, and the Texas Workforce Agency, have been working on identifying through these three state agencies, the Texas Workforce Commission, TEA, and coordinating board, on identifying and growing paid work-based learning opportunities. For those of you who have not seen it, there is a report issued by the Tri-Agency Initiative that is available online. The cover of that report is on this slide that talks about the various initiatives that are going on to identify and grow paid work-based learning opportunities across the state. So we won't spend too much time on this slide at all, but know that it is an important recommendation that came from the commission and one that is being worked on by the Tri-Agency Initiative. And then finally, we will move now back to Brady for a little bit about investments in college capacity. Brady.
Thank you, Ray. So I like to think of capacity building in kind of two big buckets. So there is the Institutional Collaboration Center that will be housed at the coordinating board, and then there's workforce training infrastructure kind of more broadly. So HB 8 allows the coordinating board to establish an institutional collaboration center within the agency to support the implementation of the new community college funding system, but also for the efficient and effective operations of institutions of higher education. It also allowed the coordinating board to provide administrative support and services to institutions of higher education as necessary to implement the provisions of the bill. And for this part, the coordinating board can partner with an affiliated nonprofit organization to accept gifts, grants, or donations to pay for goods or services procured for the direct benefit of an institution of higher education. It also allowed the coordinating board to use money appropriated to them to procure such goods and services that will be a direct benefit to the institution of higher education, and enter into an interagency contract with those institutions. So basically, HB 8 generally gave the coordinating board some authority to help implement these kind of institutional collaborations. The budget included $16.5 million each year and 7 new employees to improve institutional collaboration and innovation, and included grants to institutions to meet regional workforce needs, which we'll talk about in a second. Finally, the budget also included about $500,000 each year for a course sharing platform that was formerly the Virtual College of Texas that was at ACC. So what does this all mean, and how do we get here? So Senate Bill 1230 explicitly required the commission to address the feasibility of establishing shared service agreements or other interinstitutional collaborations through which institutions may perform administrative services for each other for a fee or some other consideration. Notably, this did not include direct instruction or student support services. And so the work to figure out how to get from that point to where we are today was the College Operations Work Group that we talked about earlier in the program. And they wanted to explore how kind of the variations in community college resources affect how those institutions operate, and how also the trends and patterns in enrollment and other implications such as regional, economic, and demographic effects can affect the operations of institutions. So they define shared services as support for interinstitutional partnerships, master services agreements, and shared state technology infrastructure. They noted that shared services are underway already, mostly through informal arrangements and partnerships across institutions, and that IT was obviously a growth area in the future, as this can kind of drive down costs for institutions. And so to consider how to implement shared service agreements more broadly, they considered varying cost drivers for community college operations and opportunities to enhance college operations through cost savings and efficiencies. And obviously, this could lead to cost reductions, process improvements, and increased investments in student supports and programs. And they believed that any formula that was created through HB8 should provide incentives for institutions to collaborate to the extent that shared services would help expand capacity for them. And that it should reflect the particular challenges of small and rural colleges and needs, and also set expectations for local support. So this led to an eventual recommendation of the commission, which stated that the state should support and facilitate shared services and stronger interinstitutional partnerships, and that the coordinating board should facilitate shared services to enable individual colleges to improve operational efficiency and expand the range of academic and workforce programs that they may offer. And this could include partnerships with other community colleges, technical colleges, or four-year institutions in university systems, and obviously with the coordinating board as well. And so, as you can tell, I'm kind of based on the language I talked about in HB8 versus kind of what was in the commission. The kind of rubber will meet the road when coordinating board is implementing this, as the legislation gives them a pretty significant amount of flexibility in how they implement it. And so we will be following it obviously very closely, ensuring that the coordinating board kind of stays faithful to both the commission recommendations and to what was in HB8 as well. And so for the workforce training infrastructure, the work of the commission kind of built on the previous work of the legislature regarding things like the TRUE initiative. So in 2021, the legislature passed Senate Bill 1102, which created the Texas Reskilling and Upskilling Through Education, or TRUE program, which was meant to be a collaboration between colleges and business partners across the state to rapidly provide well-designed short-term credentials, ensuring displaced and underemployed workers are armed with the skills and credentials needed to fill high demand and industry needs. So it was meant to be a competitive grant program that was administered by the coordinating board, and eligible two-year colleges would receive grants to put Texans back to work in these high demand occupations. But it also helped institutions kind of either create, expand, or design such programs. So either build upon one that already existed or to create one kind of anew. And so they kind of wanted the community colleges to work with employers, chambers of commerce, and other local partners to kind of create these programs in fields that they thought were important. And so the commission recommended that the legislature draw on the insights from the initial implementation of TRUE, and that the state should give priority to short-term workforce programs developed in partnership with employers. So notably, basically they said TRUE is doing great, and then they added this one change, which you'll see at the bottom right corner of the slide. So basically HB8 made one significant policy change to the program. As originally passed, the coordinating board was allowed to give preference to applicants who partner with local chambers of commerce, trade associations, economic development corporations, and local workforce boards. Notably, employers was added to that group as well. So, it's not something that wasn't already happening. Obviously, employers were consulted, as these were supposed to be kind of high demand skills, but HB8 just kind of codified that as well and just said, hey, when you're creating these programs, you should also talk to employers in the community as well. And so obviously we will be following the implementation very closely on that as well, and any future efforts by legislatures to kind of maybe put some additional funding into TRUE. As noted in the slide, it was kind of seeded with $15 million of federal funding. And so there's obviously continued conversations on kind of what the optimum funding level for that will be in the future.
Thank you so much, Brady. Okay, so we're going to turn here to the final few slides and talk very briefly about implementation. What I should have said at the beginning of the presentation is we are building an FAQ page on the TAC website. So please, if there are questions that you have, you don't have to just do it through this format here in this webinar. There is a Q&A function that you could populate with some questions if you like. But you can just send us, just email me, Elizabeth, anybody on this call, or Sandra, any questions that you have. We are going to build in an FAQ functionality so that we can keep up with your questions, and to the best of our ability, of which many of the questions may not be fully answered until we get through at least the initial emergency rulemaking process, we're going to try to keep that as current as possible to give your questions as full of an answer as we can, depending on the information. So with that, let me turn to my colleague Elizabeth Shivers to talk briefly about the road ahead. And just to preview this, the TAC CEOs have had discussions, certainly our TAC officers, and have asked that our association, that TAC, take a sort of hands-on approach towards implementation, working closely with the coordinating board, sitting in on each of the meetings of the Community College Advisory Committee, and keeping our members fully informed on implementation efforts. We will look to increase some of our capacity here at the association to provide some increased technical assistance and other things for each of you as members of our association. And I think Elizabeth will touch upon that as she goes through these final few slides. So Elizabeth, if I can turn it over to you, please.
Yes, thank you, Ray. So if we can go to the next slide. Basically, I wanted to give you a little bit more detail on the Community College Advisory Committee. As we mentioned early on, it's part of HB 8, specifies the creation of this Community College Advisory Committee to partner with the coordinating board and inform the rulemaking. So So this group actually has already been meeting informally because there is so much work that we know needs to happen for these emergency rules to be in place. Basically, the idea is this committee is working closely with the coordinating board to get emergency rules written to send to the governor by mid-July, and then in August there will be a special called board meeting to pass those emergency rules to allow us to start the new fiscal year with funding based on this model. But as you can see, we have representation from our very large, medium, and small colleges. Notably, Dr. Serrata, the El Paso College president, is the chairman of this committee. He is also currently the chairman of our officers committee here at TAC. And you can see that this group is actually a mixture of CFO, IR, and CE people. So the idea was to try to make sure we had the right perspectives in the room to help inform any of the discussion relevant to HB 8, whether it's things like what the payment schedule should be under the new funding model, or what kind of reporting glitches or technicalities we might expect that folks are going to need to overcome from our IR folks, or providing additional perspective around this non-credit space that currently isn't fully captured from CE. So these folks will become our official advisory committee that continues to inform the rulemaking process throughout. Next slide, please. Okay, so basically we've done as Ray mentioned, we've been asked to sort of get as involved as we can to help spearhead moving forward in implementation. And so we have identified 6 main strategies that we think are going to be important for you at the institutions to actually be able to implement this. And so those main strategies really are rulemaking, which we've talked about, and I'll talk a little bit more about in a minute around this. We see that as the first most critical piece for us to actually be able to implement HB 8. Also, capacity building, data and reporting. So we recognize that in addition to there being some new needs around HB 8 at your institutions that can be filled by things like shared services, we also know that there's going to be some new reporting requirements moving forward around this. So we want to help you to understand here's what you're going to be responsible for. Then we also know technical assistance is going to be very important. So once we have the what all carved out, it's going to be important that you all know the how. And so anything we can do to help contribute to that, we want to step up and take that role. Of course, we want to be an information broker for you all and make sure that you're getting the right communication and kept in the loop about everything that's happening across the board with HB 8 implementation. And then we also know planning and sustainability is going to need to be a key piece of this. And so right now at TAC, we've identified this group of initial partners. We imagine it's going to continue to expand, but we're committed to trying to help build our own capacity to help assist you all with this process. And so we hope to continue to be great partners for you and help everyone understand how to successfully implement this. Next slide, please. Okay, as we have alluded to several times in this process, we see rulemaking as an ongoing process. So as we mentioned, emergency rules are this first piece where we expect the draft to be mid-July. So there will be near final information on what budgets are going to look like from the formula funding for the institutions. It is very noteworthy there is no public comment period. So part of the emergency rulemaking process is it needs to happen quickly. So if you have any comments, any questions, anything you want to make sure that this advisory committee is aware of as the emergency rulemaking process moves forward, please reach out to us at TAC to help facilitate that, to make sure you have all the information needed. And then in August, regular rules will start up with the intent for those to be implemented in January. And that will cover all of FY24. Then we envision a third rulemaking process starting up in March of 24 to inform the following year. So that will be really getting into here's what FY25 is going to look like. And with that, I'd like to invite Ray, if you think there's any additional detail we need to know on the rulemaking, I invite that from you.
No, I think you've covered it really well, Elizabeth. This is a critical time. One thing to point out, which we've talked to the CEOs before, with emergency rulemaking, there's not the traditional publication in the Texas Register. And I hope, I don't know if I'm repeating something you already said, Elizabeth, but that's going to be critical, is that over the next couple of months, we are going to try to do our very best here at the association to reflect back to you in great detail what the work of the agency along with the advisory committee, what that work looks like, because things will move quickly once there's a draft set of rulemaking, and it won't be published in the Texas Register as is normally the case because this is emergency rulemaking. So I think you did a good job in covering all of that, Elizabeth. The final slide here is just a recapping of what Elizabeth talked about: the rulemaking, capacity building, the reporting, the technical assistance, the comms, and of course, the planning and sustainability. A lot of that is at a statewide level. TAC will be here to support you as much as we can for those statewide components. But of course, a lot of this is also work that you'll have to do at a local level. We are cognizant of that, and we will continue to remind all stakeholders, but particularly the coordinating board, of your needs there at your campus and at a local level. So with that, I think we are ready to wrap this up. We want to thank you for your participation and for your interest. Obviously, this is transformative, historic legislation. We welcome your input. If there are particular categories of webinars that we ought to consider having where we can take a closer look at certain topics, please give us your input. Let us know what that is. Send us your questions. We'll continue to update our FAQ page once we have it posted, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. And please do not ever hesitate to contact any of us for additional information. We are here to help support each of you as our member institutions. We appreciate all that you do for us as well. So with that, I want to thank my colleagues. Elizabeth, any final thoughts? I see you unmuted.
Yeah, there was just one other thing I wanted to add around the upcoming webinars. Since everyone attending today registered for this webinar, you will actually be also notified of any future webinars that we do. So you'll get the update on here's what we're planning and here's who we're targeting as those get placed on calendars.
Yep. Okay. Thank you all very much for your participation today. We'll talk again soon. Have a good day.
Thank you.